Misinformation. I paused there like it's two words. No, I'm not talking about a female whose name is Misinformation. I'm talking about the one word misinformation. What do we know about it? We know it's dangerous, right? It's real dangerous. But why is it dangerous? We know it's a great way to mudsling if you wanted to face somebody online and totally discredit them. But quick question, is misinformation more dangerous coming from Joe Blow on Facebook, telling his Facebook friends, hey, I had a bad reaction from a vaccine? Or is misinformation dangerous when it's coming from an official point of view? So somebody like an institution or, I don't know, a government or, I don't know, like a pharmaceutical company whose interests are tied to what the public believes about the topic at hand. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few instances of what I believe are official misinformation. Because listen, the misinformation has been directed on ordinary people like you and me. I've been called a disseminator of misinformation for something negative I said about Biden on my Facebook page. Are millions and millions of people looking at my Facebook page determining how to run their own lives? First of all, I hope not. Second of all, no, they're not. Nobody cares what I have to say except maybe, like the few close friends and family I have. Maybe they care about my opinion. But as far as the public at large, I think it's safe to say I don't have a lot of influence. I'm not coming from an official position. I'm not somebody in power. I'm not somebody profiting off of what people believe about what I say. People who are in power and disseminating information that is false, when they have something to gain from that information, that's true misinformation, and that's what I deem is the real problem. So some of the worst lies in recent history, I'm just going to go through a few just to illustrate how dangerous it truly is for somebody in a position of power whose goal is to gain more control, more money, more power, pushing a narrative that benefits them. And how really the public, we're not the ones guilty of misinformation, regardless of what we think, whether we've had great experiences with a pharmaceutical drug, whether we've had poor experiences, whether we believe, that the Trump rate is justified or that it's total BS. It doesn't matter what we believe. Our job as ordinary people is to hold those institutions accountable. And we're kind of a built-in, if we truly have free speech without censorship, we are a built-in mechanism to kind of keep them in check. And say, hey, because really, ultimately, we're the only defense against misinformation. Not just, ultimately, most importantly, the decisions we're making in our own lives based on what we think is true, but also, coming together and standing up against people in positions of power who are abusing that power by lying to us. It's really our job to be vocal about that and say, hey, there's something up here, there's something a little bit fishy, and we're going to call it out so that it doesn't just snowball into a situation like what we're seeing, I think, happen around us. And I'm going to quote a journalist who I think is actually, and I can't believe I'm quoting a journalist. There are some good journalists out there. There really are. And one of them, I think, is Matt Taibbi, Taibbi. I'm probably butchering his last name. But in his words, he talks about how, in order for something to be deemed as misinformation, what you first have to have is somebody deciding what's true and what's not about any given topic. And usually, in the case of COVID in particular, it's the government and public health agencies. Let's keep in mind, they are funded primarily by pharmaceutical companies. And if they're the ones who are deciding what's true and what's not true, then they ultimately get to have the monopoly on lying. Unless, again, we as a public and ordinary people push back. And we push back in the way we spend our money. We push back in the way we vote. We push back in the way that we speak to each other, as to the extent that we're allowed to these days on social media. So a couple of examples of more official misinformation, and you can look this up. I'll include links in the show notes. In a press briefing, Jen Psaki, ironically enough, was talking about the importance of combating COVID-19 misinformation. And she talks about how She's talking about the COVID vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, that they have, quote, gone through the gold standard of the FDA approval process. Y'all, when people say that these vaccines are experimental, they're not wearing their tinfoil hats being conspiracy theorists. They are experimental in the sense that they are not actually FDA approved. The FDA has approved them for emergency use purposes because they haven't had enough time to go through the rigorous process of FDA approval. So we won't really know whether or not these drugs are FDA approved for a while. And I would say that, especially in combination with squashing people who are talking about negative side effects, something you certainly don't see in the media, is the definition of dangerous misinformation, because you're not giving people full disclosure and the ability to make true informed decisions about their health. Another example, antidepressants. So you can read, I'll include a link to an article in The Guardian. 1 in 6 Americans is on antidepressants. And this, by the way, this has nothing to do, by the way, with whether or not you should take antidepressants, whether or not they're helpful for any individual person, whether or not you should take the vaccine, whether or not that's helpful, whether it works or it doesn't work, whether it's dangerous or not dangerous. It's not about that. It's about having access to all of the information and not being fed misinformation by people who have a vested interest in us believing that they do work. So antidepressants, their use has skyrocketed since 1999. Guess what's also skyrocketed since 1999? Depression in the United States. And 1 in 6 Americans is on antidepressants. And this was all the kind of impetus in the profits that these pharmaceutical companies were making off of antidepressants, and it's continued to make, was really born from the idea that it's caused by a chemical imbalance, and that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance, specifically low serotonin levels in the brain. Well, now it's come out like, oh, actually that is not true. There is no scientific support. Even after loads and loads and years of studying and data, there is no indication, scientifically speaking, that depression has anything to do with not just low serotonin levels, but any sort of chemical imbalance in the brain. Whoops. Sorry, you guys. Now, why this is important, because it doesn't mean, listen, I've been on antidepressants in the past. And this does not mean that they don't work, that they don't serve a purpose, that they don't have some sort of utility. It does mean that this kind of information, and you see it in every pharmaceutical ad for an antidepressant, they talk about low serotonin levels and chemical imbalances. Where it's detrimental is when people believe that, they think that a go-to solution for their depression is going to be antidepressants. And that potentially harms people by, first of all, making them ignore the negative health side effects of taking antidepressant medication to various extents and various side effects depending on the drug that you're looking at. But it also possibly, there's evidence that it deters people from looking for other possible treatments. So talk therapy and other forms of therapeutic interventions, yoga, mindfulness therapies, meditation, exercise, things that we know help with, healthy brain function and with chemicals in our brain, getting the good ones going. It can prevent people from looking for alternate sorts of treatment. So again, this has nothing to do with whether or not you like your antidepressants or not. If you like them, keep taking them by all means. But the public has a right to make an truly informed decision about their health. And they can't when side effects are downplayed while this chemical imbalance narrative is played up. COVID vaccines. Right now we have whistleblowers from all of our big government organizations or government and public health institutions calling out just the gross mishandling of the information that's being disseminated about vaccines and treatments for COVID. Paxlovid, I don't know if you saw in the news, it's old news at this point because it was a couple weeks ago, but surprisingly enough, it didn't work the way that the manufacturers of Paxlovid told us it would work. What they released from their just piss poor clinical trials data. And by piss poor, I mean like it was kind of a joke calling it clinical trials because it was such a small set of sample data. But saying that the reinfection rate, for example, was 2%, when now we know it's closer to 40%, as illustrated by the president of our country getting a second surge of COVID after taking Paxlovid. So again, this doesn't mean that Paxlovid won't work for you. It doesn't mean you shouldn't take it. It does mean that you should know that it's not quite as effective. Like you have a lower shot than we originally thought of it working properly. And by the way, it also comes with certain risks, just like any pharmaceutical intervention comes with risks. So when we have these disseminators of misinformation tipping the scales artificially by upplaying the benefits and downplaying the potential risks, when we see that those scales are actually a little bit more balanced, like maybe the benefits are down here a little bit closer to the level of risk, a lot of people are going to choose to make a different decision than they would have otherwise. So why do we hear all of this? What's the reason? Well, Big Pharma, so they spent $28 million on lobbying in 2018. Guess what the number was in 2021? They've gone from, and this is, steadily risen over time. They spent $28 million in 2018 on government lobbying, $356.6 million in lobbying our government in 2021. And does somebody want to tell me that our government isn't complicit in this, that our government doesn't have an interest now and to the tune of $356.6 million, that our government officials don't have a vested interest in Big Pharma being successful? And what do we see on the news? Every major media outlet, whatever their version of Health Watch or whatever they call it, that health segment that they do. Pay close attention. It's always, these days, sponsored by Pfizer, brought to you by Johnson & Johnson. How convenient, because quick reminder, TV revenue overall, 70% of it, not even talking news organizations specifically, TV overall. They get their revenue. How do they make money? It's from advertisers. 70% of their advertising money comes from pharmaceutical companies. Is Fox or CBS or NBC going to come on when they're getting 70% of their revenue and talk to you about adverse reactions to vaccines or how antidepressants, probably don't work, or talk to you about harmful side effects of various medications? Probably not. It's not that great for their bottom line. So I think we have to be extra diligent. I think we should go easier on each other for, even if, my friend posts something and I disagree with it, I don't think it makes it misinformation. I'm sorry. I think what's misinformation, if anybody is culpable for whatever false information my friend online is disseminating, if anybody's culpable, it's the people in positions of power who have an interest in that information being disseminated and widely accepted as fact. They're the people pushing that are the people who are culpable for whatever comments I see from my friends on freaking Facebook and Instagram. We're ordinary people. We are not the ones who are dangerous disseminators of misinformation. That's just a load of crap. I don't care which side of the aisle you're on, which side of any of these issues that I'm talking about you're on. And just for bonus points, I just want to talk really quickly about, this has nothing to do with misinformation. Well, maybe it loosely does, but excuse me. The Inflation Reduction Act. LOL, that's a hilarious framing of this bill. And I'm sure, most of you have seen in the news, we have 87,000 more IRS agents thanks to this bill. Our good old friend Bernie Sanders, and I'm telling you guys this because you know that when Bernie Sanders comes out against a bill that is taxpayer funded, like a tax increasing bill, of any kind, like a bill like this, like Bernie Sanders to me would be the first on board with government spending. Bernie Sanders basically called it a joke. He called it the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. And I think, without getting into the weeds of, although I'd really like to, maybe I will at some point, or maybe I'll forget about it by then because there are more important things to talk about. But without getting into the nitty-gritty, the gist of it is expert economists have studied this bill in and out, And what's true about this bill is it will actually likely increase inflation because we know that first of all, more government spending in this multi-billion-dollar bill of yet more spending by our government and yet a further increase of our deficit. We know that fuels inflation. But overall, this is going to increase inflation in the short term. And then maybe starting in about 2024, the estimates are that it could decrease it by a level that isn't even statistically significant. It's basically a rounding error, like by like 0 point something could decrease will maybe decrease inflation in 2024. So why are we calling this an Inflation Reduction Act when it's really, we want to spend a lot of money on a lot of things, including 87,000 new IRS agents, so that we can increase inflation a little bit right now, but for the interest of ultimately decreasing it, maybe, wink, wink. All right, that's all I've got for today. Thanks for listening.